Amelia Grant walked into the blind date with a polite smile rehearsed, certain the evening would cost her nothing but an hour of talk. Mason Carter looked like what her mother had promised. A quiet single father in a faded jacket, pleasant, forgettable within a week. She decided within minutes he belonged to a world far beneath her own. She never imagined the restaurant had been watched for hours. When the glass shattered, three strangers surged toward her table, and the room dissolved into screaming chaos. Mason set down his water glass, pulled her behind him, and whispered one word. The restaurant sat near the heart of downtown Chicago, all dim gold light and hushed conversation, the kind of place where reservations were currency and silence carried a price tag. Amelia Grant arrived exactly on time, dressed in a tailored navy coat that made every head in the room turn briefly before returning to their own affairs. She was the chief executive of Grant Meridian Group, a financial technology empire her grandfather had founded and her mother had spent decades polishing into a symbol of old money discipline. People did not usually keep Amelia waiting, and she did not usually wait for anyone, yet here she was, seated at a corner table because her mother had insisted that her private life needed repair before the press did the repairing for her. Evelyn Grant had been clear on the phone the night before. The board was murmuring about Amelia's image, about a woman who worked past midnight and dated no one and smiled for cameras only when required. A blind date, Evelyn had said, was a small price for quiet. Amelia had agreed mostly because arguing cost more energy than complying, and because some distant part of her, buried under spreadsheets and quarterly targets, wondered what an ordinary evening might feel like. Mason Carter arrived 4 minutes late, wearing a jacket that had clearly survived several winters and shoes that had been polished by hand rather than habit. He apologized briefly, mentioned something about closing his shop, and sat down without the practiced charm Amelia usually endured from men in expensive suits. She studied him the way she studied underperforming portfolios, quickly and without sentiment. Pleasant face, tired eyes, nothing remarkable. He told her he repaired watches and the occasional heirloom clock for old clients who trusted no one else with their grandfather's timepieces. Amelia masked her disappointment with a practiced smile, the same one she used in shareholder meetings when a number disappointed her. She asked polite questions about his work, and he answered without elaboration, without trying to impress her, without performing the way most men did once they learned her last name. He didn't seem nervous around her wealth or reputation, which struck her as either confidence or indifference. She assumed the latter. What she did not notice, because she had no reason to, was the way his eyes moved. He was not looking at her the way other men looked at her. He was reading the room, the exits, the reflections in the windows, a waiter whose uniform did not quite match the others, a black sedan parked too long across the street with its engine still running. He answered her questions evenly while cataloging every detail with quiet precision. She decided somewhere between the appetizer and the entree that he was kind enough, harmless enough, and entirely unsuitable for the world she lived in. She began composing, in her head, the gentle text she would send her mother afterward. Nice man, wrong fit. Mason, for his part, said nothing about the sedan outside, and nothing about the second glance the waiter had given their table. He simply reached for his water glass, took a slow sip, and kept his attention fixed quietly on the door. Amelia began looking for a graceful way to end the evening early, already rehearsing the kind excuse she would offer at the door. Mason did not seem disappointed by her cooling tone, which surprised her more than it should have. He simply kept talking calm and unhurried, as though the success or failure of the date meant little to him either way. At one point he asked, almost casually, whether she usually traveled with a security detail. The question landed wrong, too personal, too pointed for a man who fixed watches for a living, and she felt the familiar flicker of irritation she reserved for anyone who pushed past the boundaries she set for strangers. She told him, with more edge than necessary, that her security advisor, Lucas Reed, had arranged tonight's schedule personally, and that the restaurant had been vetted thoroughly. Mason's expression shifted at the mention of Lucas's name, a flicker so brief that Amelia nearly missed it, gone before she could decide what it meant. He said nothing further, only nodding once, the way a man nods when he has heard something he already suspected, but hoped he was wrong about. Her phone buzzed before she could press him on it. Abigail Stone, her assistant, calling earlier than their usual check-in window. Amelia excused herself only slightly, answering at the table since she had nothing left to hide from a date she had already mentally dismissed. Abigail's voice carried an edge of unease rarely heard from her. The driver assigned to tonight had been swapped at the last possible minute, she said, and the secondary security team outside was unfamiliar, not the usual rotation Amelia had grown used to recognizing by face. Amelia felt a small cold thread work its way down her spine, though she refused to let it show. She had built her entire career on appearing unshaken, and she was not about to unravel that composure in front of a man she would never see again after tonight. Mason, watching her carefully, suggested gently that she not leave the restaurant just yet. She asked him why, sharper than intended, daring him to have an answer worth her patience. He answered without drama. 2 men at the bar had glanced toward their table 3 times without ever ordering a drink. One waiter wore shoes that did not match the restaurant's uniform policy, scuffed black instead of polished Oxford. And the service exit near the kitchen had been quietly blocked by a delivery cart that had not moved in over 20 minutes, positioned exactly where it would slow anyone trying to leave through that door. Amelia went still, a chill settling beneath her composure despite every instinct urging her to dismiss it as nonsense. She asked, almost mockingly, how a watch repairman noticed details like that, expecting some fumbling answer that would confirm her assumption that he was simply an anxious, overly cautious man. Mason only said that a man who repairs watches learns to notice the smallest details long before the mechanism stops working entirely, because by the time it stops, the warning signs are already long gone. Before Amelia could respond, the lights above the bar flickered once, then twice, and the front window shuddered under the weight of something striking it hard from outside. 3 men shoved through the restaurant's front entrance, loud and disordered in the way drunk troublemakers were supposed to look. Except their movements carried a coordination that no amount of alcohol could fake. Glasses shattered against the floor as panicked diners scrambled from their tables, chairs toppling, a woman screaming somewhere near the bar, waiters abandoning trays mid-stride. One of the 3 men moved with deliberate purpose straight toward Amelia's table, cutting through the chaos like he already knew exactly where she sat. Amelia's stomach dropped when the man spoke her full name, not shouted in confusion but stated with the flat certainty of someone reading from a list. This was not a random robbery, not some opportunistic chaos born from a bad night. Someone had sent him, and he had known precisely where to find her. Beside her, Mason changed in a way that startled her more than the attackers did. The quiet, unremarkable man from minutes earlier dissolved entirely, replaced by someone utterly, frighteningly in control of every inch of the room. He did not rise in panic. Instead, he reached over and pulled her chair backward at the exact moment a thrown bottle sailed through the space where her head had been a heartbeat earlier. Amelia gasped, pressed back against him, too stunned to do anything but watch. Mason used a folded napkin, a half-empty water glass, the edge of the table, and the angle of a nearby chair to disable the first attacker without adding to the surrounding chaos, his movements economical and almost silent, nothing like the loud chest-puffing violence she had seen in films. He struck cleanly, efficiently, like a man solving a problem rather than winning a fight. The second attacker pulled a small blade, and Mason caught his wrist in a single motion, twisting just enough that the knife clattered uselessly to the floor before the man understood what had happened to his own hand. The third attacker lunged for Amelia, trying to drag her toward the rear exit by her arm. Mason wrapped his own jacket around the man's forearm and drove him down hard against the edge of a table, pinning him there with controlled weight. Amelia stared at the calm settled deep in Mason's eyes, a stillness that felt, strangely, like the only steady thing left in a collapsing room. Mason scanned the scene and understood something the chaos itself had been hiding. These men were not trying to kill her. They were trying to take her somewhere else entirely. He pulled her up by the hand, moving fast but never careless, weaving between overturned chairs and fleeing patrons until they reached the narrow hallway leading toward the kitchen. Smoke from a dropped candle curled near the bar, mixing with the smell of spilled wine and fear. Amelia's heels caught against the tile twice, and both times Mason's grip kept her upright without slowing their pace. Behind them, shouting continued, but distance and a swinging door began to swallow the sound. Mason shoved the kitchen door shut once they were through, jammed a length of metal piping through the handle to buy precious seconds, and turned to face her fully for the first time since the attack began. His voice, when it finally came, was low, steady, and entirely without the gentle hesitance he had carried throughout dinner. This was not random, he told her. Someone had planned every second of it. Amelia stood in the narrow kitchen hallway with her breath coming in short, uneven pulls, the polished control she wore like armor in every boardroom completely stripped away for the first time in years. She finally asked the only question that mattered, her voice thinner than she intended. "Who are you, really?" Mason did not answer immediately. Instead, he crouched beside the man he had pinned earlier and retrieved a phone that had slipped from the attacker's pocket during the struggle, scanning it with quick, practiced eyes. He found a thread of messages containing turn-by-turn directions to the restaurant, a rough sketch of the dining room layout, and a photograph of Amelia taken from across the street earlier that evening. The most recent message, sent less than an hour ago, instructed that the target needed to be moved through the rear exit before 8:40. Amelia felt the floor tilt slightly. Lucas had personally confirmed the 8 o'clock reservation, had walked her through the schedule himself that very morning. Mason asked her plainly who knew which table she would be seated at, which car she had taken, and which door she would eventually leave through. Amelia resisted the thought forming in her mind, unwilling to believe that Lucas, a man who had guarded her family for years, could possibly have betrayed her. Mason did not push the accusation further than the facts demanded. He simply told her that the most dangerous person in any room is rarely the one causing the chaos. It is the one who convinced everyone else that nothing was wrong in the first place. Shame crept into Amelia's chest, hot and unfamiliar, as she remembered judging this man minutes earlier for his faded jacket and his quiet, modest profession. She had decided almost instantly that he belonged beneath her notice, and now he stood as the only steady thing standing between her and whoever wanted her gone. Mason offered no blame for her earlier dismissal. He seemed entirely unconcerned with being right about himself, focused instead on what mattered now. What mattered now, he told her gently but firmly, was making sure she survived the night and kept control of her company once the sun rose again. Amelia understood, watching him work through the scattered evidence with calm precision, that Mason had not simply rescued her from physical danger. He had recognized, faster than she had, that something far larger than a single violent night was unfolding around her, something with deeper roots and longer planning than three strangers crashing through a restaurant door. Together they searched for another way out, moving carefully past steel countertops and hanging pans toward a service corridor that led to the alley behind the building. Mason paused at a junction box near the rear door, frowning slightly. The security cameras covering this exact section of the corridor had been disabled, deliberately and recently, the small red recording light dark, where it should have glowed steady. It was not damage from the chaos inside. It was preparation, careful and quiet, completed long before the first glass had ever shattered. Amelia's phone buzzed again in her clutch, and she pulled it free with trembling fingers, already dreading what she would find. A new message from Lucas filled the screen, calm and concerned, asking exactly where she was so he could send someone immediately to bring her to safety. Mason told her not to respond right away, his hand resting lightly on her wrist as though steadying a glass about to tip over. He asked her instead to send something deliberately misleading, a short message claiming she was still safely seated in the main dining room. The reply from Lucas arrived almost instantly, far too quickly for a man supposedly worried sick from a distance, confirming exactly what Mason already suspected. Someone was watching the situation unfold in real time, close enough to react within seconds. Mason used the attacker's confiscated phone to send a false signal of his own, nudging the remaining men toward the wrong side of the building entirely, buying precious minutes neither of them could otherwise afford. Amelia, despite everything unraveling around her, began to trust the steadiness in his judgment, though she still insisted they call the police immediately rather than continue improvising in dark hallways. Mason agreed without resistance, but warned her carefully that if Lucas had planted anyone inside her company's own security systems, any call placed from her personal number could be tracked the moment it left her phone. Amelia borrowed Abigail's private line instead, sending a brief, urgent message that carried none of the corporate formality she usually relied on. Abigail responded within seconds, already moving, already pulling internal records to understand what exactly had gone wrong inside Grant Meridian Group, while Amelia had been sitting through an unremarkable dinner. Meanwhile, Mason guided Amelia through an old delivery passage at the rear of the building, careful to avoid every angle a camera might still be capturing. Outside, the night air hit her face cold and sharp, momentarily clearing the fog of panic clouding her thoughts. A black SUV idled at the curb, engine running, doors unlocked as though waiting specifically for her arrival. Mason studied the driver through the windshield for only a second before quietly identifying the problem. This was not anyone from Amelia's usual security rotation, not a face either of them recognized from months of routine pickups and drop-offs. Lucas appeared from the shadows near the corner of the building, his expression arranged into convincing concern, calling Amelia's name and urging her toward the open car door with practiced urgency. For one dangerous moment, Amelia's instinct to trust a familiar face nearly carried her forward, years of habit pulling her body towards safety she no longer actually had. Mason's hand closed gently but firmly around her arm, holding her in place before she could take the step that would have ended everything differently. Lucas's eyes found Mason across the short distance separating them, and something shifted behind his carefully maintained calm, a flicker of recalculation passing over his face. He was no longer looking at an unremarkable man in a tired jacket. He was looking at a problem he had not accounted for, a variable that had somehow slipped past every careful arrangement he had made for tonight. His voice, when it finally came, had lost its earlier warmth entirely, replaced by something colder and far more honest. "You should not have been here tonight," he said, each word measured and deliberate, the mask finally beginning to crack along its edges. Mason pulled Amelia into a side alley, putting distance and angle between them and Lucas's line of sight before the man could organize whatever came next. Amelia, breathing hard against the brick wall, finally demanded the truth in full. No more careful half-answers. No more polite evasions wrapped around the edges of what he actually was. Mason exhaled slowly, the first crack of hesitation she had seen in him all night, and began to speak. He had once worked within a private protective unit, handling crises for powerful executives, the kind of work that never appeared in headlines because success meant nothing visible ever happened at all. Kidnapping attempts against business leaders, extortion schemes targeting shareholders, internal sabotage disguised as accidents. He had saved people far wealthier than the man currently fixing watches in a quiet storefront, until one mission years ago ended with his own superiors selling him out to protect a client's reputation instead of protecting him. After that, he disappeared from the industry entirely, choosing anonymity over recognition. Amelia asked, quieter now, whether he had known Lucas before tonight. Mason admitted he knew the name from old files, reputation rather than personal history, though he had never realized Lucas was currently working for her specifically. Lucas, he explained carefully, had once been connected to a staged attack designed to pressure a different chief executive into signing away a controlling stake in her own company. That earlier case had been buried quickly and thoroughly, witnesses vanishing or recanting under pressure, leaving Mason as perhaps the only person still alive who understood exactly how the operation had been constructed from the inside. Amelia felt something cold settle deep in her chest as the pieces began arranging themselves into an uglier shape than simple kidnapping for ransom. This was not about money changing hands quietly somewhere offshore. This was about control, about removing her entirely from a position of power long enough for someone else to seize it cleanly. Mason asked whether she had anything important scheduled for the following morning, anything that could not simply wait a day or two without consequence. Amelia's mind raced backward through her calendar until she landed on the board meeting scheduled for early morning, a vote on a merger agreement quietly backed by Jackson Vale and an outside investment fund hungry for influence inside Grant Meridian Group. If she disappeared tonight or returned tomorrow looking unstable, the board would have every justification it needed to hand temporary control to someone else entirely. Jackson had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening for longer than she had realized. Mason's conclusion arrived flat and certain, stripped of dramatics. Tonight's attack was never truly about violence for its own sake. It was a calculated method of removing her from the board before a single vote could be cast in her favor. Amelia looked at him then, really looked, no longer measuring him against the faded jacket or the modest shop or the awkward small talk from earlier in the evening. For the first time since sitting down at that overpriced corner table, she found herself looking at the one person in her entire orbit she might actually be able to trust completely. Mason guided Amelia through a maze of side streets and quiet alleys threading beneath Chicago's skyline, deliberately avoiding the main avenues where cameras hung from every corner and traffic cameras logged every passing vehicle. Amelia had never once in her adult life needed to disappear from anyone, and the unfamiliar sensation of fleeing made her hands shake even as her mind raced through possibility after possibility. Mason kept his voice low and even beside her, reminding her gently to breathe, to focus on the next 10 steps rather than the entire unraveling night ahead. At some point near a darkened storefront, she pulled off her heels entirely, carrying them in one hand as the cold pavement bit against her bare feet, the polished, untouchable image of a chief executive cracking apart piece by piece with every block they crossed. Mason eventually led her to a narrow storefront tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered bakery, unlocking a door marked only by a small hand-painted sign reading Watch and Clock Repair, established years earlier by a man who clearly valued quiet permanence over flash. Inside, the space felt entirely different from anything Amelia had known in years. Soft lamplight fell across a workbench lined with careful rows of tools, each one cleaned and returned to its precise place after use. Dozens of old watches rested in glass cases along the walls, gears and springs exposed mid-repair, patient and unhurried work in progress. A single framed photograph sat face down on a shelf near the back, offering only the faintest hint of a private life Mason clearly kept separate from everything else. Mason retrieved a small locked box from beneath a floorboard near his workbench, opening it to reveal an old communication device long retired from active use and a thin folder of handwritten notes documenting past cases connected loosely to Lucas Reed. Amelia's stomach tightened when she noticed Grant Meridian Group referenced in a note dated nearly 6 months earlier, written in Mason's own careful handwriting. He admitted with visible reluctance that he had once been quietly hired to investigate a security leak surrounding her, only to withdraw entirely once he suspected the very people who hired him might be the same people attempting to manipulate her from within. Amelia felt betrayal settle over her like a second, heavier coat, the realization spreading that nearly everyone surrounding her in recent months had been working some private angle she never noticed. Mason did not try to soften the weight of that realization, but he reminded her quietly that she still had Abigail, someone whose loyalty had never wavered through any of this, and more importantly, she now had something far more valuable than misplaced trust. She had the truth, finally visible, finally hers to use. Before either of them could plan their next move further, Abigail's call broke the quiet of the small shop, her voice tight with urgency. She had uncovered an emergency resolution quietly being drafted overnight, one designed to remove Amelia from her position as chief executive before the sun even fully rose over the city the following morning. Abigail had spent the past hour quietly digging through internal approval logs, cross-referencing security clearance changes against the night's strange irregularities, and what she found left her hands trembling slightly over her keyboard. Lucas had personally altered Amelia's travel route earlier that evening, rerouting her driver and adjusting the security rotation without flagging either change through the usual channels of oversight. Worse still, Jackson Vale had already signed a preliminary memorandum with a rival investment fund days before tonight's events, positioning himself perfectly to benefit from exactly the kind of crisis now unfolding. If Amelia turned up missing or returned visibly shaken, the board would have every justification it needed to label her unfit for continued leadership, transferring temporary control directly into Jen's waiting hands. Amelia wanted to drive straight to company headquarters immediately, but Mason stopped her before she could even reach for her phone. He reasoned calmly but firmly that headquarters had almost certainly been compromised by now, watched closely by people waiting for exactly this kind of desperate, unguarded appearance. Lucas was counting on her walking in rattled, disheveled, and visibly broken, he explained, because a panicked chief executive made for an easy story about instability and poor judgment. Mason proposed something steadier instead. Amelia needed to appear at precisely the right moment, in front of the full board, carrying evidence so complete that no amount of spin could undo it. Abigail began transmitting everything she had gathered directly to Mason's old device. The altered messages, the manipulated schedule, the early merger agreement, and confirmation that the restaurant's security cameras had been deliberately disabled before the attack ever began. Mason laid the pieces out across the small workbench, arranging them with the same careful precision he applied to disassembled watch mechanisms, until he recognized one critical piece still missing. They needed something that connected Lucas directly to the men who attacked her, not circumstantial timing but his actual voice giving the order. Amelia, thinking quickly now despite her exhaustion, remembered that the restaurant maintained a private recording system inside its exclusive event room, originally installed to handle high-profile clients and sensitive business dinners requiring discretion and documentation. Mason decided almost immediately that they needed to return to the restaurant before Lucas had time to realize the recording even existed, let alone erase it entirely. Amelia insisted on coming along this time, refusing once again to remain a passive bystander in the unraveling of her own life and career. Mason hesitated only briefly before agreeing, though he made clear that every single instruction he gave from this point forward needed to be followed exactly, without hesitation or improvisation on her part. Together they moved back through the quiet sleeping streets toward the very building where everything had first gone wrong only hours earlier. By the time they arrived, Lucas had already arranged for the scene to be sealed off and quietly reframed in police reports as an ordinary, unremarkable robbery gone slightly out of control, evidence already beginning to vanish beneath layers of careful, deliberate management designed to bury the truth entirely before morning light could expose it. The restaurant sat dark and unnaturally quiet by the time they returned, most of its lights extinguished, only a skeleton staff lingering near the entrance after being told to leave for the night. Mason guided Amelia through the same kitchen door they had escaped through hours earlier, the metal still faintly dented from where he had jammed it shut against pursuit. Amelia froze briefly as the smell of spilled wine and faint smoke returned to her senses, the memory of shattering glass crashing back into her chest hard enough to steal her breath entirely. Mason did not rush her forward or press her to move faster than her racing heart could manage. He simply stood beside her in silence, allowing her the space to find her own footing again, a small gesture that meant more to Amelia than any reassurance words could have offered. It was the first time she fully understood that his protection extended beyond physical strength, reaching into something quieter and far more respectful of what fear actually demanded from a person. They located the small control room, housing the restaurant's audio and camera systems, tucked behind an unmarked door near the private event space. The primary recordings had already been wiped clean, exactly as Mason expected, but a secondary backup drive, rarely used and easily overlooked by anyone unfamiliar with the system's full architecture, still held everything intact. Mason worked quickly to extract the data, his fingers moving with the same patient precision he applied to delicate watch mechanisms back at his shop. Footsteps echoed down the hallway before either of them could finish, two of Lucas's men returning to confirm the scene had been properly sanitized. Mason handled them with efficient, controlled speed, careful to avoid noise that might draw outside attention. Amelia, surprising even herself, moved without hesitation this time, locking a side door to slow any pursuers and triggering a kitchen alarm deliberately to draw one man's attention away from the hallway. Together they secured the recording they needed, a clear, damning piece of audio capturing Lucas's own voice instructing his men that Amelia needed to be removed from the restaurant before the board's emergency session could even begin. Relief lasted only seconds before Lucas himself appeared near the rear exit, flanked now by more men than before, his earlier mask of polished concern completely abandoned. He no longer bothered pretending loyalty toward Amelia or anyone connected to her family's company. His tone carried something colder, almost amused, as he addressed Mason directly rather than her. Tonight perhaps Mason could save her from immediate danger, but tomorrow morning's board meeting belonged entirely to people far more powerful than one quiet man with a talent for disabling amateur attackers in dimly lit hallways. Lucas turned away calmly, already lifting his phone to his ear, instructing Jackson Vale to move the scheduled meeting forward and begin the proceedings far earlier than originally planned. Mason and Amelia were forced into a tense pursuit through emptied streets, Lucas's remaining men spreading out methodically across nearby blocks in an effort to corner them before they reached anywhere safe. Mason refused to turn the night into a spectacle of unnecessary heroics, relying instead on intelligence, terrain, and careful timing to slip past each attempt to box them in. Amelia noticed, even amid genuine terror, that every choice Mason made seemed designed to minimize harm rather than prove anything about his own capability or control. They eventually took shelter inside a multi-level parking structure, climbing several floors above street level where shadows pooled thick between concrete columns. Lucas called Amelia's phone directly, his voice calm again, offering what he framed as a reasonable deal. If she agreed to step down from her position and approve the merger quietly, he promised to leave Mason entirely alone afterward. Amelia understood, perhaps for the first time all night, that this decision extended far beyond her company and its quarterly earnings reports. It reached directly into the question of what she owed the man who had risked everything to keep her alive through circumstances neither of them had chosen. Mason told her plainly that she should not sign anything for his sake, that his safety was never meant to be part of any negotiation. Amelia answered just as plainly that she would not be signing out of fear any longer, regardless of what came next for either of them. Abigail called again moments later with worse news. The board's emergency session had been moved up dramatically, now scheduled for 6 in the morning instead of the original later hour, leaving them only a narrow window to act before Jackson and Lucas could finalize their plan uncontested. Mason settled on one final approach, deciding against further hiding in favor of a direct, calculated move straight toward company headquarters, though never through the obvious main entrance everyone would expect them to use. He reached out to an old contact named Hunter Blake, a former legal specialist who once owed Mason a debt neither of them had ever needed to discuss openly until now. Hunter agreed without hesitation once he understood the stakes, promising to forward copies of every piece of evidence directly to a trusted federal prosecutor and prepare additional backup files in case anything was intercepted or destroyed along the way. The plan, fragile as it was, finally had enough structure to survive contact with whatever waited for them at sunrise. As the first pale light began creeping over the skyline, Mason guided Amelia toward the edge of the Grant Meridian building, approaching from an overlooked side entrance rarely used by anyone outside maintenance staff. Lucas, still convinced they remained trapped inside the parking structure across town, had no reason yet to suspect Amelia was already standing minutes away from the boardroom itself, Evidence in hand, exhaustion etched across her face, but resolve burning steadier than it had all night. The city around them slowly woke into ordinary morning rhythm, utterly indifferent to the quiet war that had unfolded through its streets only hours earlier, while inside the looming glass tower ahead, the people responsible for tonight's chaos prepared to seize control of everything Amelia had spent her entire life building. The boardroom on the top floor of Grant Meridian's headquarters carried the kind of tension that pressed against the chest before a single word was even spoken, glass walls reflecting a sky still streaked with the pale colors of early morning. Jackson Vale stood near the head of the table, voice measured and grave as he announced that Amelia had gone missing following a violent attack the previous night and could no longer be considered fit to continue leading the company through such instability. Evelyn Grant sat near the front, visibly shaken, clearly persuaded by Jackson's careful framing that her daughter needed to step back, at least temporarily, for her own protection. Lucas remained positioned just behind the board members, playing the role of loyal security advisor with practiced ease, his expression arranged into convincing concern for a woman he had spent the entire night trying to remove permanently from power. Just as the room prepared to move toward a formal vote, the heavy double doors opened and Amelia walked through them, exhaustion visible across her face, hair slightly undone, makeup long since faded, nothing resembling the polished executive who normally commanded this room. Yet something in her eyes had hardened overnight, steadier and more certain than anyone in that room had seen from her in years. Mason followed quietly behind her, saying nothing, deliberately staying out of the room's focus rather than drawing attention toward himself. Jackson reacted first, pivoting quickly to attack Mason directly, calling him a dangerous stranger who had manipulated and destabilized Amelia during a moment of extreme vulnerability. Lucas added that Mason carried a documented history of violence from his years in private security, framing the truth in the way most likely to alarm a room already primed for fear. For one brief moment, Amelia felt herself wavering, the distorted version of Mason's past threatening to plant doubt where certainty had stood seconds earlier. Mason made no attempt to defend himself, content to let the moment pass without seeking the room's sympathy. It was Amelia who finally stepped forward on his behalf, refusing for the first time in her adult life to let someone else define the truth before she could speak it herself. Abigail moved to the front of the room and projected a series of documents across the main screen. The manipulated travel schedule, the messages exchanged between Lucas and the men who attacked the restaurant, and the early merger agreement Jackson had quietly signed days before any of this began. Jackson attempted weak denial, suggesting the documents could easily have been fabricated or taken entirely out of context. Mason stepped forward then, placing the backup drive from the restaurant directly onto the table, letting Lucas's own recorded voice fill the silent room with explicit instructions to remove Amelia before the board could ever convene properly. The room fell completely silent, the kind of silence that follows the exact moment denial becomes impossible to sustain any longer. Evelyn's hand rose slightly to cover her mouth as the full weight of what she had nearly allowed settled over her, the realization that the man she had trusted for years had come dangerously close to destroying her own daughter for the sake of influence and leverage. Lucas's composed expression finally cracked the edges as he understood, all at once, that every careful exit he had planned had already quietly closed around him. Lucas's calm finally shattered entirely, desperation overtaking whatever careful strategy he had relied upon throughout the night, and he lunged forward attempting to seize Amelia as a hostage right there inside the crowded boardroom. Mason had anticipated exactly this kind of collapse and already stood positioned perfectly between Lucas and Amelia, blocking the path before Lucas could close even half the distance separating them. Lucas sneered as he moved, mocking Mason as nothing more than an abandoned soldier, a man who spent his career saving wealthy people only to be discarded and forgotten the moment he became inconvenient to someone's reputation. The words struck closer to the old wound than Lucas could possibly have known, and Amelia caught the brief flash of pain crossing Mason's features before he buried it beneath practiced discipline once again. Lucas closed the final distance between them, but Mason did not answer with anger or wounded pride. He moved with the same precise economical control he had shown throughout the night, neutralizing Lucas directly in front of the stunned board members without inflicting any serious harm, every motion calculated to end the confrontation as cleanly as possible. The room watched in stunned silence as a man, twice mocked for his modest profession, dismantled a calculated threat in mere seconds, without raising his voice or losing his composure. Moments later, police officers and a federal prosecutor Hunter had alerted earlier that morning entered the boardroom, moving swiftly to take control of the unfolding situation. Jackson attempted to slip quietly toward the exit during the confusion, only to be stopped immediately. Once officers confirmed his name matched evidence connected to illegal financial arrangements made days before the attack. Lucas, restrained and clearly furious at how thoroughly his plans had collapsed, still managed one final remark directed at Amelia as officers led him away. She would never truly know, he said coldly, who around her could actually be trusted. Amelia met his gaze without flinching, the words landing with far less weight than he clearly intended them to carry. Whatever power his manipulation once held over her had quietly dissolved sometime during the long night now finally drawing to a close. Mason retrieved his worn jacket from where it had fallen during the brief struggle, preparing quietly to step away from the room before gratitude and attention could gather around him the way it always seemed to gather around moments like this. Before he reached the door, Amelia called his name, her voice carrying clearly across the boardroom full of people who had spent the entire morning watching her world nearly collapse. She was not calling him back as someone simply grateful to have survived the night. She was calling him back because, for the first time since their disastrous mismatched dinner began, she genuinely wanted to know the whole truth of who this quiet, careful man actually was. In the days that followed, news outlets across the city carried reports of a quietly devastating attempt to seize control of Grant Meridian Group, framing it as one of the more elaborate corporate sabotage cases the city had witnessed in years. Amelia retained her position as chief executive without serious challenge, while Jackson faced a growing federal investigation into his financial dealings, and Lucas confronted far more severe charges connected directly to orchestrating the violent restaurant attack. Evelyn visited her daughter privately that week, offering an apology that carried genuine weight beneath its careful delivery. She admitted she had arranged the blind date purely to protect the family's public image, never imagining it would place Amelia near actual danger. Amelia did not blame her mother entirely, but she made clear that her personal life would no longer function as a tool for managing public perception going forward. Abigail stepped into an expanded operational role within the company, helping Amelia completely rebuild internal security protocols from the ground up, ensuring no single person could ever again quietly manipulate schedules or access without immediate detection. Mason, meanwhile, returned to his small shop, deliberately avoiding the handful of reporters who tried tracking him down once word of his role in the night's events began circulating through certain circles. He declined every interview request without exception, preferring his quiet anonymity over any version of recognition the story might offer him. Amelia eventually found her way back to his shop on a quiet afternoon, dressed simply, without the polished armor she usually wore in front of cameras or board members. She thanked him sincerely, though Mason gently redirected the gratitude, reminding her that she had ultimately saved herself the moment she chose to face the truth rather than retreat from it. Amelia asked with genuine curiosity rather than accusation why he had never mentioned his past during dinner before everything fell apart around them. Mason answered simply that his past was never something he intended to use as a way of impressing anyone during an ordinary blind date arranged by someone else's expectations. Amelia smiled, faint and a little rueful, acknowledging quietly that she had judged him too quickly and too harshly within the first few minutes of meeting him. Mason did not hold the admission against her, though he reminded her gently that real trust required more than a single dramatic night to fully take root between two people who barely knew each other. Before she left the shop that afternoon, Amelia set her father's old watch carefully on the counter, asking Mason if he might be willing to repair it, a small object she had carried for years without ever quite finding the right moment to have it properly restored. It gave her, she realized as she walked back out into the afternoon light, a perfectly reasonable excuse to return to that quiet little shop again sometime soon, without needing to explain herself to anyone. Mason spent careful hours repairing Amelia's father's watch, eventually discovering a short inscription engraved along the inner casing about courage and honesty, words clearly meant for someone the original owner had loved deeply. Amelia explained, when she returned to collect it, that her father had once taught her to judge people by how they behaved when no one else was watching them at all. A lesson she realized she had quietly forgotten somewhere along her long climb toward the corner office she now occupied. Mason shared a little more of his own life during that visit, explaining that he had chosen the quiet rhythm of watch repair specifically because he enjoyed restoring things other people had already given up on entirely. He mentioned, briefly and without elaboration, that family responsibilities had shaped many of his choices towards stability over recognition in recent years, a detail offered honestly but without inviting further questions Amelia respected enough not to push past. She appreciated the boundary without needing to understand every detail behind it. The two of them shared that evening, choosing a small, unremarkable restaurant tucked away from the kind of attention either of their separate worlds usually attracted. This time, Amelia did not measure Mason against any invisible scale of status or wealth, and Mason no longer viewed Amelia as a representative of the privileged world that had once betrayed him so thoroughly. Their conversation flowed with far less guardedness than before, each gradually setting aside the defenses they had both carried into their very first meeting. Amelia eventually asked him directly whether he would have wanted to see her again at all, had the entire evening unfolded normally without any violence interrupting their first dinner together. Mason admitted honestly that he would have, though he confessed uncertainty about whether someone like her could ever truly want a second date with a man who spent his days quietly fixing other people's broken watches. Amelia answered that she was equally uncertain whether she deserved someone who had witnessed every fractured, frightened part of her and chosen to stay anyway, rather than walk away once the danger had finally passed. Mason reached across the small table and gently suggested they begin again properly, this time as two people choosing each other freely, without her mother's careful arrangements or any external pressure shaping the outcome from outside. Amelia agreed quietly, something easing in her chest that had remained tightly wound since long before the attack had ever begun, a tension she realized now had little to do with danger and far more to do with years of guarding herself against genuine connection. A month later, Grant Meridian Group held a press conference announcing a rebuilt internal security framework alongside a new support fund dedicated to victims of corporate manipulation and coercion. Amelia stood before the cameras with a strength that felt different from the practiced composure she once relied on. No longer a woman hiding fear behind a flawless, untouchable image. She thanked the people who had helped her protect the truth, careful never to turn Mason into a headline or a marketing opportunity for the company's recovery narrative. Mason remained quietly at the back of the conference hall, deliberately avoiding attention, content simply to witness the moment without becoming part of its public spectacle. Evelyn watched her daughter's eyes drift toward him more than once throughout the event, and finally understood something she had missed for years. Her daughter never needed a powerful man to elevate her social standing further. She needed someone honest enough to remain standing beside her once everything else around her had threatened to collapse completely. Abigail leaned toward Amelia afterward with a small, knowing smile, teasing gently that the worst blind date of her entire life had somehow turned into the single best decision she had made in years. Amelia laughed softly, the sound lighter and freer than it had been in longer than she could easily remember. Once the cameras and reporters finally cleared from the hall, she made her way toward Mason, finding him exactly where she expected, quiet and unhurried near the edge of the emptying room. She handed him back the watch he had repaired weeks earlier, fully restored and ticking steadily once again, explaining softly that some things were never truly broken beyond saving. They simply needed the right person patient enough to open them carefully and understand what had gone wrong in the first place. Mason understood immediately that she was no longer speaking only about the watch resting gently in his palm. The two of them left the hall together through a side exit, deliberately avoiding the cameras and lingering reporters still gathered near the main entrance outside. There was no dramatic public declaration, no rushed promise of forever exchanged beneath flashing lights for the world to witness and remember. There was only the quiet, steady presence of two people who had each carried real wounds long before they ever met, choosing now, deliberately and honestly, to rebuild something slower and far more genuine than either of them had previously believed themselves capable of finding. Amelia once assumed Mason was simply an ordinary single father arranged into a forgettable blind date by a mother desperate to manage appearances. She never imagined that the most unremarkable man in the entire room would turn out to be the only person capable of holding her whole fractured world together once it finally, completely fell apart around her. And somewhere beneath the quiet hum of the city continuing on exactly as it always had, two people who once measured each other by appearances learned instead to measure each other by everything that mattered far more. Stay until the very last scene because the quiet truth Mason hides will change forever how Amelia sees love itself.